So I've never really spent any time in the desert. Has anyone here ever spent time in a desert? I don't know. Okay, a couple of you have. I can't say. I mean, maybe driving through it briefly, or something that you might vaguely call kind of resembling the desert. Not much time in my life spent in a desert. Now I have been in areas that you'd probably describe as the wilderness, except it's kind of the wilderness of northern Minnesota. That's Minnesota's from where I'm from. And I've been on any number of trips where you got out in the wilderness and there was no one around other than maybe the people that you were out there in the wilderness with. And so I've been off and away from other people. And I've been out in the wilderness then for a couple, 3 days at a time sometimes, where you're sitting there and you're trudging on and you get thirsty and hungry and are longing for some of those trappings of civilization. The story I was reading here and thinking about Elijah off in the wilderness of the desert and the things that he was faced with made me think of the one time I was up with some friends of mine. And these were guys that I'd grown up in high school with, and during college every once in a while we would go on one of these wilderness trips, or at least what we described as wilderness trips. And there was one time we were out in the woods for like 3 days. And we were just getting really, really done with being out there in the wilderness, in the woods. And so we decided we were going to head out for the nearest city. And so we got out of the woods as fast as we could, and we got to the road, and we were craving getting towards something that resembled civilization. We were tired of being out in the woods. We were tired of drinking this water that tasted like the iodine tablets that we had to put in it so that we could drink it and not worry about getting sick. And we just kept looking down the road, wondering when we were finally going to get to that town so that we could drink that sweet, cold water. Maybe even water, that came right from a spigot or a pipe instead of from a river, right? Oh, and even better yet, we were starting to imagine the wonderfulness that would taste like an ice-cold Coca-Cola. So we weren't happy with what we had anymore. We were longing for what was to come out there. Well, Elijah was in a desert, wilderness place here in our story today. This is a really, really interesting story. And what's kind of interesting about this one is it's one of the in-between places. Elijah and his story is one that we've probably heard any number of times. In fact, I bet pieces of it are in that storybook Bible right there. But this section that we get in our Old Testament lesson today is one that's oftentimes skipped over in the broader Elijah story. But we need to kind of pull it all together to understand this piece. And so you guys got to remember what's going on with Elijah. Who is Elijah? One of the greatest prophets of the Old Testament, right? And why is Elijah called? Elijah is called during one of the darkest times in the history of the northern kingdom of Israel, okay? This is a time when there was this new king, Ahab, and his wife Jezebel, and Ahab and Jezebel were as bad as it get. They promoted idols. They promoted Baal, and not just in a little way, but they really pushed it out in front of the people and funded it to the detriment of the worship of the one true God. And God was not going to put up with that. And so he called Elijah to go and to speak to Ahab and Jezebel and to lay it on the line. And Elijah did it, and he did it so strongly and so boldly that he said, "It's not going to rain until I tell it to." Now in North Texas, we're used to periods of a lack of rain, this spring notwithstanding, all right? But we're not talking North Texas drought. We're talking desert drought. And not just your normal desert that occasionally then gets one of those thunderstorms. He says it's going to be years before it rains again. And Ahab and Jezebel don't take it to it kindly and threaten his life. And so he has to go run away. Now, that's not this section yet. He has to go run away earlier in 1 Kings, all right? And when he's out there, that's when we get that famous story where he's out there and what does God send? Does anyone remember? Send some ravens to bring him food to eat. You guys remember that one? Okay, that's one of those famous Sunday school stories, right? And we did all kinds of crazy little things, to try to imagine what that was like, right? So God sends those ravens to feed Elijah, and Elijah is sustaining them. And eventually, God tells Elijah, "You're going to go back. And you're going to confront those prophets of Baal." And so he says, "Okay, prophets of Baal, you guys are going to gather with me on Mount Carmel, and we're going to see you as the true God." And you guys all definitely remember this story, I bet, right? And so the prophets of Baal are up there on the mountain, and Elijah says, "Okay, here's how we're going to find out who's the true God. You guys are going to pray to Baal, and if he can set your sacrifice, your altar on fire, then okay, good. But guess what? I'm going to do the same thing over here after you're done." And so the prophets of Baal, right, they gather the and they put the sacrifice on it, and they start calling out, and nothing happens, and they call out a little bit longer and louder, and Elijah starts teasing them and says, oh, maybe he can't hear you, you got to shout louder, and they start cutting themselves and doing all kinds of crazy stuff, and of course nothing happens to their sacrifice because Baal doesn't exist. And then Elijah goes over to his, and he says, drench it in water. Drench it in water until the wood is soaked. And then he prays to God, and what does God do? Sends the fire down and consumes the whole altar like that. And the people that were out there witnessing this realized then, okay, Baal is false, God is the true God, and Elijah says, those prophets of Baal, off with them, and they're killed. Now this seems like this should be a moment of incredible victory, right? Until we come to this text. It's one of those moments in the church we celebrate as a victory until we read what happens in verses 1 through 5. This is the aftermath of this incredible victory for Elijah. Now Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done, how he'd killed all the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, may the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like one of them. And Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. And when he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there, and he went with him a day's journey into the desert. And he came to a broom tree, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. I've had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors. What a victory, huh? What a victory turned quickly into a defeat. He is on the run. And not just a little way, okay? Beersheba is the farthest town south in Judah, okay? So he's running as far away as he can get, basically, and still kind of technically be in the land. But even then, when he's down there, does he stay in Beersheba? What does it say? He goes off into the wilderness, into the desert, right? A whole day's journey. He gets outside of town, so he's completely by himself, and even that isn't enough. He lays down by these scrubby little just enough shade to cover a person, a broom tree, and he lays down there and says, God, just let it be done. Let me die. Because I'm no better than my fathers. They couldn't convince the people to stay true to you, and apparently I couldn't either. Even with that miracle that happened a little bit ago, it doesn't look good. Just take my life, God. I'm done. See, Elijah's kind of at a crossroads, isn't he? He's at one of those points where something big has happened in life. And in this case, something good followed by something really, really bad. And he's crying out to God, and he basically is crying out to God and saying, give me another sign, God. I need to know what to do here. Because what I thought was going to happen didn't happen. He thought that with this one great victory over the prophets of Baal, everyone was going to turn to the one true God. Even Ahab and Jezebel, seeing that, shouldn't they turn to the one true God? But they don't. And so he doesn't know where to take things. And he's so frustrated that in the line of many other greats in the Old Testament, including Moses and Jonah and Jeremiah and Job, he basically says to God, I've had enough. Either do something or just let me die. It's him crying out to God and saying, make it clear, God, what am I supposed to do here? I'm lost. I'm literally and figuratively feeling alone in the middle of the wilderness, not sure where to go. Give me a sign. What does God do? This is really kind of interesting to see what happens to him these next few verses. Elijah's laid it out on the line for God to give him some kind of clear, some kind of powerful sign to lift him up out of his despair. And then what happens? Verse 5, then he lay down under the tree and fell asleep. Does he get a sign right away? He goes to sleep. Okay, so no answer yet. Then we keep going. All at once, an angel touched him and said, get up and eat. He looked around, and there by his head was a cake of bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. A big, powerful sign. Some bread and water. And then what happens after that? He ate and drank, and he lay down, and he goes to what? Sleep again. He's so moved by this gigantic sign that he goes to sleep. still waiting. And the angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." So he got up and he ate and he drank. Big sign yet? More bread, more water. And strengthened by the food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb. So where's the big, dramatic sign that he was waiting for? I mean, he had just, a while back seen God consume an altar with fire. And now he's sitting there on the run again, and he's praying to God, "Please make it clear. Help me figure out what to do. How am I going to take on these people that are so intransigent, that won't be moved by your signs, God?" And God gives him sleep and bread and water. He could have found those things anywhere. And it's all he has. And it makes me wonder how many times we've been, maybe not in quite so dramatic of a way, but in a similar way to Elijah, at some kind of crossroads in our life, praying to God for a sign, for God to make it clear what we were supposed to do. I mean, I've been in wilderness places in my life, and sometimes it was after something really good that happened, and sometimes after things that were really, really bad. And I prayed to God, "Give me a sign. Just make it clear what I'm supposed to do in this case, God." And sometimes it's been big, dramatic things. I remember when my wife and I were fostering children for over 3 years, and it was the same kids that kept coming and going back, and we were praying to God, "Hey, God, could you just make it clear what we're supposed to do in this case? How are we supposed to really love these kids like our own, and they keep getting jerked back and forth, and are we supposed to take legal action, or what should we do, God? Just make it clear. We'll do what you tell us." And we felt like God answered us sometimes with deafening silence. Sometimes it's around the whole concept of job and vocation, and I think this is something that everyone in this room can probably relate to at some point in time, where you're sitting there and you're looking at the future and trying to figure out, what does God want me to do? Should I stay at this place? Should I go to this next place? Or should I move? Is God calling me to move somewhere else altogether? Take a promotion or turn it down? What do you really want me to do, God? Just make it clear. When I've looked at my own biological children, I've looked at them, and there's this incredible trust that God's placed in me, and sometimes I feel completely like it's over my head trying to figure out, okay, God, you've blessed them with these personalities and cursed them with these personalities. How am I supposed to parent them? What do I do to try to draw them closer to you, God, and to mold them so that they're children after your heart, God, not just after the world? Just make it clear, God, I'll do what you tell me to do. Sometimes it's really big, dramatic things. Sometimes it's normal situations where we sit there and we seem to find ourselves out at this crossroads praying to God, "Hey, just make it clear." And instead, it seems like we're just left alone in the wilderness, dry, with the same bread, the same water, and maybe a little bit of sleep to carry us through. When we were asking God something clear, and if he would just give it to us, then we'd do what he would say, right? So was it just bread and water and sleep? Look at the text again, and I did this on purpose. I kind of raced through it real quickly. But let's think about this text a little bit more. Elijah's sitting there, and he prays this prayer, and goes to sleep, and all at once, what happens? An angel touches him and says, "Get up and eat." And looked around there, and there was this cake of bread and this jar of water there in front of him. What was there? An angel too, right? And he goes back to sleep after eating the first time, and then the second time, it further specifies this angel. In verse 7, it says, "The angel of the Lord came back." And I don't know how much Pastor James has ever, analyzed these Old Testament passages with any of y'all before, or with some other Bible study you've done it. But do you guys know who the angel of the Lord is generally identified as? It's the pre-incarnate Jesus Christ. Now, there's some controversy around that, but the vast majority of commentators, the vast majority of people who study the Old Testament would agree that before Jesus came in the earthly body that he had, he pops up in the Old Testament, and it refers to him as the angel of the Lord. Because when the angel of the Lord comes, it acts like God himself. So what does Elijah get here? God himself coming to him and providing for him in this empty, desert, wilderness place. He gives him some things, right? He touches him, and he gives him bread, and he gives him water, and he gives him sleep. And it's easy to race past those things and say, that's not what Elijah was looking for. He was looking for some big, amazing, miraculous sign like, hey, God, send some more fire, right? And he doesn't right there. But think about it. Bread and water and sleep at that moment was exactly what Elijah needed. He was spent. He had just come down from those highs, from that emotion, from that experience. And God says, you need to be out here by yourself a little bit longer. You may not feel like it. It may not be what you're asking for, but I know it's exactly what you need. You know, sometimes God looks into our lives and we're praying for something big, we're praying for something clear, some incredible sign, and God says, I need to surround you with the normal and the mundane things for a little while. You need to appreciate those things. That bread, that water, those are my provision for you. And you look at your home and your pantry stocked with things, and God says, that is daily bread. How often have you prayed the Lord's Prayer and asked for daily bread? And God says, look how abundantly I've cared for you and given you your daily bread. That house where you lay down your head to sleep at night. We can look past sleep and just underappreciate it. And God says, that's what I give you to refresh your body, and I care about your body. Appreciate that I'm taking care of you in that way. You look at all these normal, mundane things around you and say, it's the same bread, it's the same water, it's the same job, it's the same family, it's the same people, the same friends that I'm surrounded with day by day. And God says, exactly. Exactly. I'm daily and richly providing for every one of your needs. Appreciate it. And you know, sometimes we even come into a room like this and we say, God, it's the same old church. It's the same old songs. It's the same words of absolution from the pastor's mouth. It's the same bread and wine up there that taste the same every single time I take them. And God says, exactly. Because you know what? In the midst of this room, I am sending my angel of the Lord, my Son, Jesus Christ, to touch you. To speak to you in the same words of the Bible. To feed you the living bread that's on this table that will never go away, as Jesus talks about it in John 6 in the gospel, right? So it may look the same and taste the same and sound the same, but he says, guess what? You're coming to me, the same person, with the same sins, with the same life before me, and I need to provide for you this day and this week and this year in that way. I need you to stay in this wilderness place maybe a little bit longer. And sometimes way longer than we would even expect. You know, it's interesting, after Elijah has this experience, you know, he's strengthened. And how long is his journey? 40 days and 40 nights until he reaches Mount Horeb, also known as Mount Sinai, right? From Beersheba to Mount Sinai, it's about a 200-mile journey. Should probably, with a good clip and a good walk, take about 5 days. And yet Elijah spends 40. So even after this time out there in the desert, eating that bread and that water, these normal mundane things, God says, guess what? You know, I think you need a little bit longer. 40 days being a very symbolic period of time. You need a little bit longer just relying on me and the things that I've given you. I need you to appreciate just being sustained before you get something bigger. And God says the same thing to us. Sometimes you may need to spend that 40 days, even longer than you expected, looking at what God's put around you and appreciating those things, being sustained, knowing that you're just barely hanging on, but hanging on by His incredible grace before He finally leads you to the top of the mountain. And you know what comes right after this text? Elijah goes up to the top of Mount Sinai because he knows God has revealed Himself there before and He can do it again. And He does. But even in that text, it's interesting, where, he's looking for God for the big sign, and he hears the thunderstorm, and God's not in the thunderstorm, and he looks in the fire, and he's not in the fire, and he looks in the mighty wind, and he's not in the mighty wind, and God finally speaks to him clearly in a still, small whisper. Another famous text. But God does give him the sign. And God gives him more support by saying there's all these other people who haven't bowed to Baal that are going to help you. And later on, he meets Elisha, another servant of God that goes along and strengthens him and supports him in Elijah's ministry. And later on, they have these victories over Ahab and Jezebel for the one true God. So does God finally answer him? Yes, he does. But he says, first, you need to spend some time alone, being sustained with the mundane. And sometimes it needs to last a little bit longer than you expect or think it should. It's the same for us. Sometimes we need to spend a little bit longer on the journey than we expect. Sometimes we need to be sustained by the mundane a little bit longer than we expect, because God is bringing things together for that greater outcome. As we're trudging along hill after hill, one of my friends, who apparently had a little bit better scope of the geography than myself and the second friend, kept saying, "Oh, don't worry, Dan. Don't worry, Dan." It was two Dans and a Nate. Nate kept saying, "Don't worry, guys. It's just over the next little hill." And we get over the next hill, and oh man alive, no store, no sign of civilization. "Don't worry, guys. It's just over the next hill. It's just over the next hill. It's just over the next hill." And it kept sustaining us, even though later on he revealed to us he knew very well we weren't going to be there for a few more hours. But he knew we might have given up and sat down in the woods again otherwise. And so he said, "No, it's just over the next hill. Take another drink of the iodine water, guys." And we needed that. We needed someone pushing us on, making us go a little bit further, and making us appreciate that gross iodine water as God's provision for us at that time. And you know what? Finally, a few hours later, when we did make it to the town, and we got a drink of cool, refreshing water, and yes, even a nice cold Coca-Cola, we appreciated it so much more. And God speaks to us and says sometimes, just a little bit longer. Look around me. Look what I've given you. Yes, there's something bigger. Yes, there's something clearer still to come. But appreciate what I've surrounded with you for right now. Amen. Amen.